Donald Trump and a federal judge have been sparring it out over what are the presidential powers according to the Constitution. Let's get straight into it. Currently in Portland, there are protests against ICE. ICE is under the DHS, under the president, and ICE is in charge of doing all these mass deportations across the country, specifically in areas like Portland where there were sanctuary cities. So there have been these protests going on from different leftist groups, and these protests did get out of hand. There's been some violence, some things going on. And Trump's response to the situation has been that he wants to send National Guard to federalize the National Guard and send them inside of Oregon, which opens up a huge bag of constitutional debate. We're going to get into what does the left say about this, what does the right say, and what does the Constitution actually say about a president's powers. First, let's look at the right's perspective of what's actually going on in these ICE protests inside of Portland.
These are not small crimes. This has been like a 3-month siege at a federal courthouse. They've shot lasers into the eyes of federal law enforcement, blinding them. They've cut out the fiber optics of the building so they have no internet. Arson, assault. They've barricaded the building so you can't get ICE fans in and out of there. It's a big problem. And SCOTUS has already said he's allowed to do this. I don't understand the Democrats with these bad optics. They thought it looked good in L.A. when guys were waving Mexican flags and torching cop cars, or it looks good when you're against the crime crackdown in D.C., and that city's like the most peaceful city in the country now. I believe, and Jessica will probably agree with me, they would rather have crime high than give Trump credit for lowering it.
He brings up a really good point to this discussion. So there's a couple of main subjects in this whole topic. We have the ICE raids that's going on. A big topic, though, is the actual in terms of multiple liberal run cities inside of America that President Trump has decided to intervene in. The first city being Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. is very distinct from Portland, from Chicago, from these other cities, because in Washington, D.C., it's not run by a state. So there is actually a provision inside from Congress saying that a president can use the National Guard in an emergency situation in order to maintain the city. So President Trump was pretty easily able to use that provision from Congress to take charge of DC with the National Guard. Once President Trump finished with DC, he then decided he's going to extend his powers and influence inside of other cities in the US, which is a totally different can of worms. So in DC, it's not covered by a state, so it doesn't have states' rights. It belongs to the federal government, to the people of the United States. But Chicago, Portland, any other city in the US belongs to state. And the Constitution is broken up between the difference of federal rights and states' rights. The federal government has a limit to it, and the state government has a limit to it in terms of its rights. It's the federalist versus the anti-federalist debate. President Trump has said that these high crime rates in these cities is a reason for the federal government to be able to bring military in to stabilize the region. The debate from the left, from these liberal-run cities, is they have said that actually the crime rates have gone down. The crime rates have gone down since 2020, and they're steadily going down, so there's not actually emergency situations inside of the cities. And most of all, they say is that the president cannot overreach himself inside of a states' rights issue. There's actually a provision through the Constitution for a governor with the president to be able to bring the National Guard inside of a state to help govern or maintain a region. Once President Trump announced that he is going to send troops inside of Portland, so they had this big ICE protest and things were getting out of hand, a federal judge came out and said, hey, you can't do that. They signed an injunction telling him to not send troops inside of Portland. This was the reaction from the Attorney General of Oregon to that order.
New this morning, a federal judge has blocked the Trump administration from sending the National Guard into Portland. The White House is planning to appeal. Now, in her opinion, the judge described recent clashes between protesters and federal officers as inexcusable. Oregon's Attorney General agrees.
Mobilizing the United States military in our cities is not normal. It should not be normal, and we will fight to make sure that it is never normal. Today's ruling is a healthy check on the president's power, and as the president, you must have an actual facts based on reality, not social media or just your gut feeling if you want to mobilize the military here in the United States.
As you might imagine, President Trump was not excited about this injunction from the federal judge.
I appointed the judge, and he goes like that. So I wasn't served well. Obviously, I don't know the judge, but if he made that kind of a decision, Portland is burning to the ground.
So, President,
And you have a judge like that, that judge ought to be ashamed of himself.
I want to clear something up between these judges and the president. So we've seen a lot of executive orders from the president, these mass executive orders of we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And we've also seen many injunctions from these federal judges. So where does these injunctions come from? So the federal government is made up of the legislative, the executive, the judicial branch. The executive has the president, the judicial has the courts. And the only court that's actually mentioned in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. And underneath the Supreme Court, Congress made a list of many judge positions and the Court of Appeals and this court. And there are many appointed judges underneath the Supreme Court. But ultimately, all decisions from the judicial branch go up to ultimately decisions of the Supreme Court, whether by precedent or new opinions. And these judges recently have been signing many injunctions against the presidential executive orders. And there's been a lot of debate whether these judges are acting outside of their power in doing these injunctions. I'm not here to give an opinion on it. I'm just saying there's been a ton of debate of whether these judges are allowed to have these sweeping injunctions to swipe away presidential decisions. On the flip side, there have been many debates for the last several presidential terms of these sweeping executive orders from the president. The president is somehow able to make these huge executive decisions of military and financial and policies with education, make these sweeping orders without legislative approval or any sort of vote from anyone. And so how constitutional is an executive order or how constitutional is an injunction order? These are huge debates that are going on right now about the Constitution in our own modern day. So I want to go through this injunction. What did the judge actually say about the president's orders, about why they denied the president's orders to deploy troops inside of Portland? So here's from the actual injunction itself. This case involves the intersection of three of the most fundamental principles in our constitutional democracy. The first concerns the relationship between the federal government and the states. The second concerns the relationship between the United States armed forces, and domestic law enforcement. The third concerns the proper role of the judicial branch in ensuring that the executive branch complies with the laws and limitations imposed by the legislative branch. Whether we choose to follow what the Constitution mandates with respect to these three relationships goes to the heart of what it means to live under the rule of law in America. So first of all, you see the federal government versus states, which we talked about, and then the armed forces versus the domestic law enforcement. So that's regarding, you have these ICE protests and they're coming against federal facilities and they're saying, hey, shouldn't they be relying on the local or the state level law enforcement, the police force that are there? Shouldn't they be the ones who defend? And if you bring in the armed forces from the federal government, is it superseding the authority and the ability of the local police force? The third concerns the proper role of the judicial branch, and it's talking about checks and balances between the judicial and the executive. How much control, how much power does the judicial have to halt the executive branch from overusing its rights in its executive actions? The main piece of this that I want to get into is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is saying that anything in the Constitution, any rights that aren't mentioned for the federal government are inherently thereby given to the state governments. So here we go. Defendants ultra vires federalization of Oregon's National Guard troops also violates the 10th Amendment. No matter the context, the president's authority to act necessarily stems either from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself. The Constitution grants Congress the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Going down a little bit, therefore, the president lacks constitutional authority to federalize the National Guard once he exceeds the constitutional authority that Congress granted him, such as Section 12406. Because the president is federalizing the Oregon National Guard absent constitutional authority, his actions undermine the sovereign interest of Oregon as protected by the 10th Amendment. Oregon has a 10th Amendment power to control its National Guard to the extent it is not cabined by the militia cause. The militia cause is talking about in times of insurrection or rebellion, the president can use the National Guard to federalize them to take control of the situation. This judge is saying this does not meet the militia clause requirement. Therefore, the right of the National Guard is given to Oregon, not the president. I want to know what you think. Do you think that the president has this sort of authority to nationalize the federal government in an instance like this? Or do you think it requires more of a serious situation than that? What do you think the Supreme Court is going to decide? I want to know your opinion. Don't forget to put your opinion in the comments. Like, share with a friend. I'll see you next time.